Thomas Carter stood at the pharmacy counter, his debit card flashing red with rejection, his hands trembling as he tried to buy medicine for his 7-year-old daughter Emma, who lay at home burning with fever, her small body fighting an infection he couldn't afford to treat. What Thomas didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that the quiet stranger standing behind him in the worn thrift store jacket wasn't just another tired customer waiting his turn. He was Marcus Wellington, a billionaire who had lost his own daughter 5 years ago and had spent every hollow day since wandering through the world in disguise, searching desperately for something authentic in a sea of artificial smiles and calculated kindness. Marcus watched Thomas's quiet desperation unfold, witnessed the dignified way this father held himself together even as shame colored his exhausted face. And in that single, fragile moment of pure, selfless love, he finally saw what his broken heart had been searching for all along. This chance encounter in a fluorescent-lit pharmacy at 3 a.m. would change both of their lives forever, though neither man could possibly imagine how deeply their paths were about to intertwine. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Thomas Carter woke at 5 a.m. to an alarm he could barely hear anymore, his body so trained to exhaustion that sleep felt more like a brief pause than actual rest. At 34 years old, his hands bore the calluses of a man twice his age, rough and cracked from lifting boxes at Morrison Warehouse during the day and scrubbing office floors at night. His small apartment on Riverside Avenue told the story of a life stripped down to essentials, a cramped 2-bedroom with walls so thin he could hear Mrs. Chen coughing next door and water pipes that rattled like old bones every time someone upstairs took a shower. The furniture was second-hand, donated, or rescued from curbs, but every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that came from pride, not prosperity. In the smaller bedroom, Emma slept beneath a faded star-patterned blanket, her dark hair splayed across a pillow that Thomas had carefully stitched when the seam split open 2 months ago. He stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her chest rise and fall. This tiny person who was his entire universe, his reason for waking up, his reason for enduring. The frayed coat hanging by the door had been his for 6 winters now. The lining torn, the zipper broken, and replaced with safety pins he'd carefully hidden beneath the fabric. His bank account held exactly $47.23, a number he knew without checking because he tracked every penny with the precision of a man who couldn't afford not to. His next paycheck wouldn't come for 3 more days, and until then, he'd make those $47 stretch across food, bus fare, and the electric bill that was already overdue by a week. But Emma would never know. She would wake to find oatmeal with cinnamon waiting for her. The cheap multivitamins he'd bought from the dollar store already set beside her orange juice, and her father smiling at her like he didn't carry the weight of the world on his shoulders that slumped just a little more with each passing month. Emma came home from school that Tuesday afternoon with cheeks too pink and eyes too bright, and Thomas knew immediately that something was wrong. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead the way his own mother had done for him decades ago and felt the unmistakable heat radiating from her small body. The thermometer read 101 degrees. By 6 that evening, after he'd given her the last 2 tablespoons of children's fever reducer from the medicine cabinet, it had climbed to 102. By 9, when he should have been leaving for his cleaning shift at the Summit Building downtown, Emma was curled in his lap, burning at 103 degrees, whimpering softly that everything hurt. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as he applied cool cloths to her forehead. Changed them every 10 minutes. Whispered reassurances he didn't believe himself. At midnight, when her temperature refused to drop and she started coughing with a wet, rattling sound that terrified him, he called the 24-hour nurse hotline with shaking fingers. The nurse listened to Emma's symptoms, asked careful questions about the cough and the fever's duration, and recommended he take her to urgent care for evaluation because it sounded like a bacterial infection that would need antibiotics. Not something that would resolve on its own. Thomas thanked her, hung up, and stared at his phone screen showing his bank balance. Doing math, that didn't work no matter how many times he recalculated. He left Emma with Mrs. Chen for 3 hours while he rushed through his cleaning shift, working faster than he ever had, his mind entirely on his daughter. At 3 in the morning, he carried Emma wrapped in her star blanket to the 24-hour urgent care clinic 8 blocks away because the bus had stopped running and he couldn't afford a taxi. The doctor, a tired woman with kind eyes, confirmed the bacterial infection, listened to Emma's lungs, and wrote a prescription for antibiotics, while Thomas sat with Emma cradled against his chest. The visit cost $24.06. His account balance afterward read $23.17, and the prescription still waited to be filled. The 24-hour pharmacy felt like a different world under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered overhead, casting everything in a cold, sterile white that made Thomas squint after the darkness outside. Emma's small body felt impossibly light against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder, her fevered cheek pressed against his neck, one tiny hand clutching his shirt with the desperate grip of a child who knew her father was the only solid thing in a world that had gone frightening and unfamiliar. The star blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon, the same blanket she'd had since she was 2 years old, now threadbare and faded. But still her greatest comfort. Behind the counter stood Carol, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had seen enough struggling families to recognize another one immediately. She smiled gently at Emma, asked Thomas for the prescription, and disappeared into the back to fill it while Thomas stood at the counter with his heart climbing into his throat. The minutes stretched like hours. Carol returned with a white paper bag, scanned it into her system, and said the words Thomas had been dreading. "That'll be $47.89. His hands trembled as he shifted Emma's weight to one arm and pulled his debit card from his worn wallet, the card itself scratched and faded from years of use. He knew the math, $23.17 in his account, $47.89 required. But he handed the card over anyway, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and he prayed, actually prayed, for a miracle he didn't deserve. Carol swiped the card. The reader beeped. A red light flashed across the small screen. Declined. Thomas's face flushed hot, shame crawling up his neck like fire. "Can you try it again?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carol nodded, her expression sympathetic, and swiped it once more. The beep came again. Red light. Declined. Behind Thomas in line, a man stood holding a bottle of generic antacids and a folded newspaper, the kind of ordinary props that made him invisible in the fluorescent-lit pharmacy at 3:30 in the morning. Marcus Wellington was 56 years old, his silver hair slightly too long and uncombed, wearing a jacket he'd purchased from a thrift store in a neighborhood where no one would recognize his face from the business pages. The jeans were worn but not designer. The shoes scuffed. The whole ensemble carefully constructed to make him look like what he'd once been decades ago, before the money came, before the empire, before everything that mattered was taken from him. No one in this pharmacy knew that the quiet man in line was worth $3.7 billion, that his company employed 40,000 people across 12 states, that he'd shaken hands with presidents and dined with foreign dignitaries. Without the tailored suits and the executive bearing, Marcus Wellington disappeared into the background exactly as he'd intended. He'd been doing this for 6 months now. These late-night walks among regular people, observing humanity in its rawest moments, testing his shattered faith that goodness still existed somewhere in the world after his daughter. Sarah's death had destroyed everything he thought he understood about life and meaning and purpose. Most nights disappointed him, revealed the small cruelties and casual indifferences that people showed each other when they thought no one important was watching. But tonight, watching the man at the counter, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. He noticed everything. The way Thomas's hands trembled as he held his debit card, the calluses visible even from several feet away, the sleeping child wrapped in a faded blanket covered with stars, her small face flushed with fever, her tiny hand clutching her father's shirt, the worn shoes on Thomas's feet, the soles separating from the leather, held together with what looked like superglue. But more than the poverty, Marcus noticed the dignity, the way Thomas held himself upright even as shame colored his face red. The way he spoke quietly so as not to wake his daughter, the way he apologized to the pharmacist as if his lack of money was a personal failing rather than a circumstance beyond his control. This was a man trying to hold himself together while the world crumbled around him. 5 years ago, Marcus Wellington's world had ended on a rainy Tuesday night when a drunk driver ran a red light and turned his 17-year-old daughter Sarah into a memory, a ghost, a hole in the universe that no amount of money could ever fill. She'd been driving home from play practice, singing along to music he'd never know, planning a future in social work because she wanted to help people who had nothing, and in one senseless moment, she was gone, leaving Marcus holding the shattered pieces of a life that suddenly meant absolutely nothing. His wife, Jennifer, drowning in grief, had looked at him a year later with eyes that saw only absence and said she couldn't do this anymore, couldn't wake up next to the father of a dead child and pretend there was any reason to continue. She'd left, remarried, moved to California, and Marcus hadn't blamed her because he understood that particular kind of drowning. His billions, his empire, his Wellington Industries with its 40,000 employees and its gleaming headquarters downtown, all of it ran itself now, managed by competent executives, while Marcus sleepwalked through board meetings and quarterly reports that felt like scripts in a play he no longer cared about performing. He attended charity galas where wealthy people in designer gowns wrote enormous checks and congratulated themselves on their virtue, never once actually witnessing the suffering they claimed to care about, never getting their hands dirty with real struggle or real sacrifice. The whole thing disgusted him, this performance of goodness without any genuine connection to humanity. 6 months ago, something had broken inside him, or perhaps something had finally started trying to heal, and he'd begun these late-night trips into the world, dressed as nobody, walking among regular people, watching, searching for proof that genuine goodness still existed somewhere beneath all the performance and pretense. Mostly, he'd been disappointed. He'd witnessed cruelty, indifference, people stepping over homeless veterans and ignoring crying children. Until tonight, until this exhausted father with trembling hands and a sick child tried to buy medicine with money he didn't have. Maintaining his dignity even as shame threatened to break him, Thomas pulled his phone from his pocket with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it, the cracked screen reflecting the harsh pharmacy lights as he navigated to his bank's automated line with fumbling fingers. Behind him, he could hear other customers shifting their weight, impatient sighs breaking the tension, the rustle of shopping bags, and the tap of shoes against linoleum. He pressed the phone to his ear, entered his account number, waited through the automated prompts that felt designed to humiliate him. Your current balance is $23.17. The mechanical voice confirmed what he already knew, what he'd been trying to deny. His throat tightened. He ended the call and reached back into his wallet with desperate fingers, pulling out the emergency credit card. The one he'd sworn never to use except for Emma, the one that sat behind his debit card like a last resort he prayed would never come. He handed it to Carol with a look that begged her to understand. She swiped it gently, her expression sympathetic. The machine beeped. Declined. The card was maxed from Emma's last doctor visit 3 months ago, when she'd had strep throat and the urgent care visit plus antibiotics had eaten through his available credit. Thomas felt the world tilt slightly. Emma stirred against his shoulder, her small voice breaking through his panic. "Daddy, I'm cold." The words nearly destroyed him. Carol watched from behind the counter, her eyes full of sympathy but bound by rules she couldn't break. She couldn't just give away medication, no matter how much her heart wanted to. Thomas's eyes welled with tears he refused to let fall, blinking rapidly, swallowing hard against the sob building in his chest. He started, his voice cracking. "Maybe I can call my boss. Get an advance on my paycheck. It comes in 3 days. Or my neighbor, Mrs. Jen, maybe she could lend me some money." He was calculating out loud now, grasping at possibilities that felt increasingly impossible at 3:30 in the morning. "I just need 30 minutes. Can you hold the prescription for 30 minutes? Behind Marcus, a woman in yoga pants and an expensive jacket sighed loudly. The kind of theatrical exhale designed to communicate impatience and irritation to everyone within earshot. She checked her watch, a silver thing that probably cost more than Thomas made in a month, and shifted her basket of vitamins and energy drinks from one hand to the other with pointed aggravation. Thomas heard it. Felt the weight of it, the judgment and the pressure and the knowledge that he was holding up the line with his poverty, with his inability to afford $47.89. "I'm sorry," he said to Carol, his voice barely holding together. "I'll step aside. Let me just figure something out." He moved away from the counter, Emma still cradled against him, her fevered body trembling now. Whether from cold or sickness he couldn't tell, Carol leaned over the counter, her voice gentle and meant to help. "You could try the hospital emergency room. They have payment plans, and they'll treat her tonight." Thomas nodded, but his heart sank like a stone. The hospital meant hours of waiting in harsh fluorescent rooms that smelled like disinfectant and fear. It meant forms and credit checks, and the kind of debt that followed you for years. It meant Emma sitting terrified in a pediatric emergency room surrounded by crying children and worried parents, and the beeping of machines that would frighten her. It meant adding hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars to bills he couldn't pay now. His voice cracked when he spoke again. "Can you hold the prescription? Just 30 minutes. I'll make some calls." Carol nodded, her eyes sad because she'd seen this scene play out too many times before. Thomas walked to the corner of the pharmacy near the greeting cards, sank down against the wall with Emma in his lap, and felt his pride crumble like wet paper. He'd failed. Despite working 2 jobs, despite sacrificing everything, despite trying so hard to be enough for this little girl who deserved the world, he'd failed her. She needed medicine now, not in 3 days, and he couldn't provide it. What kind of father couldn't buy medicine for his sick child? Marcus stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle the broken man sitting against the wall. "Excuse me." His voice was gentle, barely above a whisper, the tone someone might use approaching a wounded animal. Thomas looked up, his expression immediately shifting to defensive, his arm tightening protectively around Emma. Embarrassment flooded his face, the raw humiliation of being witnessed in his lowest moment. Marcus held out his credit card toward Carol at the counter, the simple black plastic catching the fluorescent light. "I'd like to pay for this young man's prescription." The words hung in the air like an offering. Thomas scrambled to his feet, nearly stumbling. No, I can't. I don't accept charity. I'll figure it out. I can't take money from strangers." The words tumbled out rapid fire, his pride the last thing he had left to hold on to. Marcus turned to look at him fully, and then his gaze dropped to Emma, her flushed face, her labored breathing, the way she clung to her father's shirt. When Marcus looked back at Thomas, his eyes held something that made Thomas's protests die in his throat. A deep, ancient sadness lived in those eyes, the kind of grief that had carved itself into a soul and made a permanent home there. "It's not charity," Marcus said quietly. "It's one father helping another. Please." The word father carried weight, carried loss, carried something Thomas couldn't quite name but could feel in his bones. Something in this stranger's face spoke of understanding, of having loved a child with the desperate completeness that Thomas recognized in himself. Emma coughed weakly against Thomas's chest, her small body shaking with the effort. That sound, that terrible rattling cough, shattered what remained of Thomas's resistance. He looked at Marcus, then at his daughter, then back again. His voice broke when he spoke. "I'll pay you back. I promise you. I'll pay every single penny back." Carol took Marcus's card with a knowing smile, the kind that said she understood she was witnessing something significant, something beyond a simple transaction. She swiped it through the reader. The machine beeped, and this time the light flashed green. Transaction approved. She bagged the medicine carefully, added the instruction sheet, and handed it across the counter with warm smiles directed at Emma, who had lifted her head slightly from Thomas's shoulder to watch with fevered, curious eyes. Thomas immediately fumbled for his phone with his free hand, nearly dropping it in his haste. "I need your information, your name, your number, so I can pay you back. I need to know how to find you." Marcus hesitated, his hand halfway to his pocket. For a moment, something flickered across his face, uncertainty perhaps, or the habit of privacy that came from years of wealth. Then he pulled out his phone, rattled off a number that Thomas typed into his contacts with shaking fingers. It was Marcus's private cell, the one only a handful of people in the world had access to. Though Thomas had no way of knowing that. They stood facing each other in the harsh pharmacy light, two men from different worlds connected by this single moment of grace. Few words passed between them, but the air felt heavy with unspoken emotion, with gratitude and grief and something neither could quite name. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, his voice still thick with emotion. "Marcus." "I'm Thomas. This is Emma." Thomas shifted his daughter slightly so Marcus could see her face properly. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means." Marcus's eyes glistened in the fluorescent light, moisture gathering at the corners that he didn't bother to hide. "I think I do." Thomas extended his hand, the one not supporting Emma, and Marcus took it. The handshake was firm, meaningful. Marcus's palm surprisingly soft against Thomas's calloused, rough skin. Two fathers, two lives, one moment of connection that both sensed meant more than either could articulate standing in a pharmacy at 3:30 in the morning. Marcus stood inside the pharmacy doors and watched Thomas leave, Emma still cradled in his arms, the white paper bag clutched in one hand. The instinct to return to his town car parked 2 blocks away. To his driver, waiting with the heat running, pulled at Marcus for only a moment before something deeper took over. He followed them instead, staying far enough back to remain unnoticed, his feet moving almost of their own accord through the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas didn't walk toward a parking lot. There was no car waiting, no vehicle that would take them home quickly and warmly. He walked toward the bus stop on the corner, his gait steady despite the exhaustion that must have been crushing him. Emma's weight distributed carefully in his arms. Marcus watched from the shadows as Thomas stopped at the bus shelter, glanced at the posted schedule illuminated by a flickering streetlight, and then shifted Emma's position so that his body formed a barrier between her and the cold wind that had picked up, whipping through the empty street. He tucked the star blanket more tightly around her, bent his head down to whisper something Marcus couldn't hear, probably reassurances, probably love. Then Thomas pulled out his phone with his free hand, the screen's glow illuminating his worried face. Marcus could see him scrolling, calculating, his lips moving silently, probably doing math that didn't add up, figuring out how to stretch $23 across 3 days, how to feed himself and Emma, how to pay for bus fare and keep the lights on. The wind cut through the empty street, and Thomas turned his back to it, making himself a shield for his daughter, even though his own jacket was held together with safety pins. Something stirred in Marcus's chest, something he hadn't felt since Sarah died 5 years ago. Not the empty purpose of running a corporation or attending board meetings, but real purpose, the kind that connected one human soul to another. Hope flickered there too, fragile as candlelight but undeniably present. The possibility that goodness still existed, unperformed and unwitnessed, in the struggling corners of the world where people like Thomas loved their children with everything they had and nothing they owned. Thomas carried Emma up 3 flights of stairs, his legs burning with exhaustion, his arms trembling from more than just her weight. Each step felt like a small victory, each landing a checkpoint toward safety. The stairwell smelled like cooking spices and old carpet. Sounds of late-night television bleeding through thin walls, the building settling and creaking around them like it too was tired. Their apartment door stuck slightly when he unlocked it, swollen from humidity, and he had to shoulder it open carefully so as not to jostle Emma. Inside, the space was barely furnished but spotlessly clean. Every surface scrubbed and organized because cleanliness was a point of pride when you had nothing else to take pride in. The second-hand couch sat against one wall, a small television on a milk crate across from it. The kitchen was cramped, just a few feet of counter space and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly. But the floors gleamed, the dishes were washed and put away, and everything had its place. Thomas carried Emma to her small bedroom, laid her gently on the bed, and retrieved a glass of water from the kitchen. He opened the white paper bag with reverent hands, read the instructions twice to be certain, and gave Emma her first dose of antibiotics with water and a sleeve of crackers from the cabinet, the only food left until payday in 3 days. She took the medicine without complaint, her trust in him absolute and heartbreaking. He tucked her into her small bed, pulled the star blanket up to her chin, smoothed her hair back from her fevered forehead. Already, he could see her breathing easier, the tension leaving her small body as the medicine began its work. She was sleeping more peacefully within minutes, her face relaxing into the innocent repose of childhood. Thomas sat on the floor beside her bed, his back against the wall, and finally let himself break. He put his head in his hands and cried silently, shoulders shaking, tears streaming through his fingers. Relief, shame, exhaustion, gratitude. All of it poured out in the darkness of his daughter's room, where she couldn't see him fall apart. He whispered into the silence, his voice broken and raw. Thank you, Marcus. Whoever you are, thank you. Thomas sat on the floor watching Emma sleep, and in the quiet darkness his mind drifted back to the beginning, to the hospital room 7 years ago, where everything had changed forever. Rachel had been in labor for 19 hours, complications mounting, her blood pressure dropping, the monitors beeping frantically while doctors shouted orders he couldn't understand. Emma had been born screaming and alive, a miracle of tiny fingers and dark hair. But Rachel had slipped away in the chaos, bleeding internally from something the doctors explained with words like rupture and hemorrhage, and we did everything we could. He'd held his newborn daughter in one arm and his dying wife's hand in the other. And in that moment his life had split into before and after. He'd been working construction then, decent money, good benefits, enough to afford the small 2-bedroom house they'd bought, together with dreams of filling it with children and laughter. But Rachel's medical bills had crushed him like an avalanche. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency procedures and intensive care and funeral costs that insurance only partially covered. The house went first, sold at a loss. Then the savings. Then everything else until all that remained was Thomas, Emma, and this cramped apartment where he tried to build something resembling a life. He'd started working multiple jobs because one wasn't enough. Because Emma needed clothes and food and stability, because he'd promised Rachel with his last words to her that he'd take care of their daughter no matter what it cost him. Every decision since then, every sacrifice, every skipped meal so Emma could have seconds. Every winter wearing the same broken coat so she could have a new one. All of it was for her. She was his entire world, his reason for breathing, the only thing that kept him moving forward through exhaustion that felt like drowning. The other men at the warehouse didn't understand why he never went out for beers after shifts, why he rushed home the moment the clock struck 5, why he kept photos of a little girl taped inside his locker. They didn't know about Emma, the little girl, who drew him pictures of stick figures holding hands labeled "Me and Daddy," who called him her hero even though he felt like he was failing her every single day. Thomas woke at 6 in the morning after only 2 hours of sleep, his body protesting every movement but his mind already running through the day's calculations and necessities. He moved quietly through the apartment, not wanting to wake Emma until breakfast was ready, and stood at the small stove preparing her favorite meal. Oatmeal with cinnamon, the cheap kind from the bulk section but made with care and stirred until it was perfectly smooth. He woke her gently, watched her eat at their small table, and walked her to the bus stop 6 blocks away, his hand holding hers, his kiss pressed to her forehead before the yellow bus arrived and swallowed her into its crowded interior. Then he walked the 12 blocks to Morrison Warehouse because bus fare added up and his legs still worked. 8 hours of lifting boxes, his back aching, his shoulders burning, his hands developing new calluses on top of old ones. The work was repetitive and mind-numbing, but he never complained, never slowed down, maintained the kind of work ethic that made supervisors nod approvingly, but never quite reward with raises or promotions. His coworkers saw his reliability, his quiet competence, but they didn't see the struggle behind it, didn't know he was running on empty. Lunch was a peanut butter sandwich he'd made at 5 that morning, eaten quickly during his 30-minute break, while other men laughed and shared stories he was too tired to follow. After his shift ended at 5, Thomas walked the 8 blocks to Mrs. Chen's apartment where Emma waited, doing her homework at the elderly woman's kitchen table. $20 a week for childcare, the cheapest he could find, and Mrs. Chen was kind even if her English was limited and her apartment smelled like medicinal ointments. Home again, he helped Emma with her homework, his tired brain working through second-grade math and spelling words. Dinner was pasta with butter. Vegetables when he could afford them, which wasn't this week. Emma ate and talked about her day, while Thomas listened like every word was precious. She went to bed at 8, her routine sacred and protected, and at 9, when she was deeply asleep, Thomas left again for his cleaning job downtown, riding the bus this time because the offices needed him by 9:30 and he couldn't walk fast enough. Marcus Wellington returned to his penthouse as dawn broke over the city, the skyline spreading beneath him like a kingdom he no longer cared about ruling. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view that real estate agents called priceless. But Marcus barely noticed it anymore. Just another possession that meant nothing. He couldn't stop thinking about Thomas and Emma, about the dignity in that exhausted father's face, about the way the little girl had clung to him with absolute trust. He poured himself whiskey he wouldn't drink and picked up his phone, calling Richard, his head of security, a former FBI agent who could find information on anyone. "I need you to look into someone for me. Thomas Carter." "I don't want to invade his privacy, Richard. I just need to understand." The report came back within 2 hours, thorough and professional. Thomas Carter, 34 years old, widower. Wife Rachel died 7 years ago from childbirth complications. No debt beyond medical bills, totaling $63,000. Payment plans established with 3 different hospitals. Currently employed at Morrison Warehouse, day shift and Summit Building Services. Night shift. Perfect work record at both locations. Never late, not once in 3 years. Never missed a day, even when coworkers reported he came in visibly sick. Supervisors describe him as reliable, hard-working. Neighbors in his apartment building describe him as quiet, kind, devoted to his daughter, always polite, sometimes looks exhausted but never complains. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. One dependent, Emma Carter, age 7, enrolled at Riverside Elementary, straight-A student. Teachers report she's bright and eager to learn, never causes trouble, always has homework completed. School counselor notes indicate she often wears clothes that are clearly too small. Bring lunch that's usually just a sandwich, but she's well cared for emotionally, speaks lovingly of her father. Marcus read the report in his leather chair, the whiskey untouched beside him, and felt something crack open in his chest. These were people actually living, actually struggling, actually being good despite every reason not to be. Thomas worked 16-hour days to keep his daughter fed and safe. Emma excelled in school despite wearing clothes that didn't fit. They had nothing, and yet they had everything that mattered. Marcus couldn't just write a check. He knew that with the same certainty he knew the sun would rise. Thomas's pride, that dignified way he'd held himself together even in his lowest moment, would refuse anything that felt like charity. Marcus paced his penthouse as the city woke below him, his footsteps silent on expensive carpet, his mind working through possibilities and discarding them one after another. Sarah's photo watched him from the mantel, silver-framed and forever 17, her smile bright and full of plans for a future she'd never reach. She'd been planning to major in social work, had spent her weekends volunteering at homeless shelters, had talked endlessly about wanting to help people who society had forgotten. What would she want him to do? How would she approach this? Sarah had never believed in throwing money at problems. She'd believed in seeing people, really seeing them, in building connections that mattered. Marcus stopped pacing and made the first call. Morrison Warehouse, where Thomas spent his days lifting boxes. What most employees didn't know, what even most managers didn't realize, was that Marcus owned the parent company, Wellington Holdings, which owned the distribution network that included Morrison. He spoke to the regional director personally. "I need to know about openings in warehouse management, better pay, benefits, room for advancement, and I need to know if there's an employee named Thomas Carter who might be qualified." The second call went to his attorney, James, who'd been handling Wellington family matters for 20 years. I want to set up an education trust. Anonymous. Structured, so it can't be traced back to me. Enough to cover any school, any degree for a 7-year-old girl named Emma Carter. But even as he made these calls, arranged these pieces, Marcus knew it wasn't enough. These were just financial solutions, bandages on symptoms rather than genuine help. He needed to do more. He needed to do this right. With real connection, not just money thrown at a problem from a distance. He needed to be present, to be real, to offer not just his wealth but his time, his attention, his friendship. Because what Thomas needed wasn't a benefactor. He needed someone who saw his worth. 3 days later, Thomas held his paycheck in his hands like it was made of gold. And in a way it was 2 weeks of 16-hour days distilled into a number that would keep them afloat for another 2 weeks. He cashed it immediately at the check cashing place that took 3%, counted out $47.89 with meticulous care, and placed it in an envelope that he tucked into his coat pocket. Then he called the number Marcus had given him, his heart pounding with nervousness and gratitude in equal measure. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop on Main Street, neutral ground, Saturday afternoon. Thomas arrived 15 minutes early, Emma beside him in her nicest dress. The blue one with small flowers that was getting too short but still looked pretty. He'd rehearsed his thank you speech a dozen times, practiced the words until they felt smooth and adequate, though nothing felt adequate enough to express what Marcus's kindness had meant. Marcus arrived exactly on time, dressed in jeans and a plain sweater, still looking like someone who could disappear into a crowd. He smiled at Emma, asked what she wanted, and ordered her hot chocolate with whipped cream without hesitation. They sat at a corner table, Emma happily drinking her chocolate and coloring on the paper placemat the server had provided. Thomas slid the envelope across the table, his hand steady despite his nerves. Every penny, as promised. Marcus took it, holding it for a moment as if weighing not the money but the sacrifice it represented, the meals this cash could have bought, the breathing room it could have provided. Then he set it down between them and took a breath. Thomas, I need to tell you something. I wasn't completely honest with you the other night. Thomas's expression shifted to concern, confusion crossing his tired face. My full name is Marcus Wellington. The name hung in the air. Thomas didn't immediately react, the pieces not yet connecting. Marcus continued, his voice quiet. I'm the CEO of Wellington Industries. Thomas's face went pale, all the color draining as recognition hit him like cold water. Wellington Industries. He knew that name. Everyone in the state knew that name. Manufacturing, distribution, real estate, billions of dollars. One of the wealthiest men not just in the state, but in the country. The man who'd paid for Emma's medicine wasn't just kind. He was a billionaire. Marcus leaned forward, his hands wrapped around his untouched coffee cup, and began to tell his story. Not the sanitized version that appeared in Forbes magazine or the carefully crafted narrative his publicist released to the press, but the raw, bleeding truth that he'd kept locked inside for 5 years. I had a daughter, Sarah. She was 17 years old, brilliant and kind, and planning to change the world through social work because she believed people mattered more than profit. His voice caught, steadied, continued. 5 years ago, a drunk driver ran a red light on a Tuesday night and took her from me. Just like that. One moment she existed, and the next moment there was just this hole in the universe where she used to be. Thomas sat perfectly still, Emma coloring beside him, unaware of the weight of what was being shared. My wife Jennifer, she left a year later. She told me she couldn't look at me without seeing Sarah's absence, couldn't wake up next to the father of a dead child and pretend there was any reason to keep going. I don't blame her. I understood that kind of drowning. Marcus's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. My money meant nothing. $3 billion couldn't save Sarah from a drunk driver, couldn't bring her back, couldn't fill the emptiness. I kept going to galas, writing checks, attending charity events where wealthy people congratulated themselves on their virtue. But I never actually saw people, really saw them. It was all performance, all distance. He paused, took a breath that seemed to hurt. 6 months ago, I started walking among regular people, dressed like this. Invisible. I was searching for proof that goodness still existed somewhere in the world. That humanity was worth Sarah's faith in it. Mostly I was disappointed. Then Marcus looked directly at Thomas, and his voice grew thick with emotion. And then I saw you. A father who would give anything for his daughter, who maintained dignity even in desperation, who promised to repay $47.89, even though it meant not eating for 3 days. You reminded me what actually matters. Not the money. Not the empire. Just love. Just showing up. Just being there when it counts. Marcus set down his coffee cup and leaned back. His expression open and honest in a way that suggested he'd thought carefully about what he was going to say next. I want to help you, Thomas, but not as charity. As an investment in genuine goodness, in the kind of person the world needs more of. Thomas started to shake his head, to protest, but Marcus raised a gentle hand. Please, let me finish. I've made some calls. Morrison Warehouse needs a new logistics manager. Better pay, benefits, health insurance, regular hours. You'd be perfect for it. You know the work inside and out. You're reliable. Everyone speaks highly of you. The position is yours if you want it. Thomas's mouth opened, but no words came out. Marcus continued, his voice steady and sure. I've also set up an education fund for Emma. It will cover any school she wants to attend, from now through college and beyond. She's brilliant, Thomas. She deserves every opportunity. The words hit Thomas like physical blows, each one overwhelming, impossible to process. His eyes filled with tears he couldn't control. I can't accept this. It's too much. I'm not. And I want to establish a friendship, Marcus interrupted gently. I need people in my life who see me as Marcus, not as Marcus Wellington the billionaire. Who'll tell me the truth? Who'll let me be part of something real instead of this performance I've been living? Thomas sat frozen, overwhelmed, his pride warring with the practical reality that this could change everything for Emma. He started to refuse again when he felt a small hand squeeze his. Emma had stopped coloring and was looking up at him with her mother's eyes. She leaned close and whispered, soft enough that only he could hear, Daddy, say yes. Marcus watched them, saw the moment happening between father and daughter, and added one more thing. I don't want to replace anything in your life, Thomas. I don't want to take away what you've built or diminish what you've accomplished. You've created a beautiful life with Emma despite impossible circumstances. I want to support that. My money doesn't mean anything sitting in bank accounts. Let it mean something by helping a good man give his daughter the opportunities she deserves. Let it mean something by giving me back a reason to care about the world. Thomas sat perfectly still, his mind a battlefield, where pride and practicality waged war against each other. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to maintain the independence he'd fought so hard to preserve, to prove he could provide for his daughter without help from anyone. But then he looked at Emma, coloring peacefully beside him, and saw her worn shoes under the table. The dress that was getting too short, the future stretching ahead of her, full of potential that his 2 jobs and exhaustion couldn't fully support. He thought about Rachel, about the last conversation they'd had before Emma was born, when she'd made him promise that their daughter would have every opportunity, every chance to become whoever she wanted to be. Rachel wouldn't care about pride. She'd care about Emma having health insurance, about Emma going to good schools, about Emma not having to watch her father work himself into an early grave. Thomas looked back at Marcus and searched his face for pity, for the condescending benevolence he'd seen in wealthy people who treated the poor like projects or pets. But he didn't find it. Instead, he saw respect, even admiration. Marcus wasn't looking at him like someone who needed saving. He was looking at him like someone worth knowing. Thomas took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. On one condition. His voice was steady, firm, the voice of a man setting boundaries, even in acceptance. Emma and I, we still live our life. We make our own decisions. We don't become your project, your good deed to make you feel better about yourself. We become your friends, real friends, equal friends. Marcus's eyes glistened with tears that finally spilled over, tracking down his face without shame. A smile broke across his features, genuine and relieved and full of something that looked like joy. "I was hoping you'd say that. I need friends more than I need another tax write-off." Thomas extended his hand across the table, and Marcus took it, their handshake firm and meaningful, sealing not a transaction, but a bond. Emma, sensing the importance of the moment with the intuition children sometimes have, carefully set down her crayon and extended her small hand to Marcus too. He took it solemnly, shaking it with the seriousness it deserved. "Friends," she said, trying out the word. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice thick. "Friends." 6 months passed like pages turning in a story that was finally being written with hope instead of desperation. Thomas Carter wore a button-down shirt to work now, managing logistics at Morrison Warehouse. His decisions respected and his experience valued. The pay was better, the hours more reasonable, and he had health insurance that meant he didn't lie awake at night terrified of Emma getting sick. Emma attended Riverside Academy, a better school where teachers recognized her brightness and nurtured it, where she had friends and art classes and a library full of books she devoured like treasure. But they still lived in their apartment on Riverside Avenue, in a slightly better unit now with 2 real bedrooms and windows that didn't stick, but still modest, still in the same building where Mrs. Chen lived and where Thomas had learned to survive. He'd insisted on earning his way, on paying market rent, on maintaining the life he'd built with his own hands even as opportunities opened before him. Marcus Wellington had become a regular visitor, a fixture in their lives who showed up for Emma's school plays sitting in the audience beside Thomas, who joined them for simple dinners of spaghetti and garlic bread and laughter around their small kitchen table. He'd learned to live again, to feel something besides the numbness that had consumed him since Sarah's death. Thomas had paid back the $47.89 within the first week, insisting despite Marcus's protests, and Marcus had framed it in his office where it hung beside his daughter's photo. A reminder of what actually mattered. Emma called him Uncle Marcus now, the title bestowed with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who understood that some people earned their place in your family, and every single time she said it, Marcus's eyes filled with tears he no longer bothered to hide. Sometimes kindness isn't about grand gestures or enormous checks written from a distance. Sometimes it's about seeing another person's humanity in their darkest moment, about recognizing dignity in desperation, about understanding that love and sacrifice are worth more than any fortune. Marcus didn't save Thomas that night in the pharmacy. Thomas saved Marcus by showing him that goodness still exists in the struggling corners of the world, that love still wins even when everything else fails, that a father's devotion to his daughter is the most valuable currency in any universe. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness matters and that we're all connected by our capacity to care for each other, then share it with someone who needs hope today. Because somewhere out there, someone is standing at their own pharmacy counter, wondering if goodness still exists. Be their answer.